In the mist-covered hills of ancient Britain, where stone circles stand sentinel over forgotten secrets and the wind carries whispers of a time when magic and reality intertwined, there exists a story so powerful that it has survived 1,500 years of doubt, destruction, and disbelief. This is not just a tale of a king who may or may not have lived, but a mystery that stretches across centuries, continents, and the very fabric of human imagination. Tonight, we begin a journey into the shadows of history, where the line between truth and legend blurs like morning fog over a battlefield, and where every archaeological dig, every ancient manuscript, and every crumbling castle wall might hold the key to answering one of history's most enduring questions. Did King Arthur really exist? The answer, as you will discover, is far more complex, fascinating, and surprising than you ever imagined, woven through layers of Celtic mythology, Roman occupation, Saxon invasions, medieval romance, and modern scholarship that has spent lifetimes trying to separate the man from the myth. As we settle into this exploration, let your mind drift back through the centuries, past the industrial age, past the Renaissance, past the medieval courts where poets sang of Camelot, all the way back to a time when Britain was a wild frontier, when civilization was collapsing, and when the need for heroes was so desperate that perhaps, just perhaps, one man rose to meet that need, or perhaps the people created him from their deepest hopes and fears. Chapter 1: The Dark Age Crucible. The story of King Arthur cannot begin with Arthur himself, for to understand whether this legendary king existed, we must first understand the world that supposedly gave birth to him, a world shrouded in darkness both literal and metaphorical. The period historians call the Dark Ages earned its name not because people lived in ignorance, but because so little written evidence survived from those troubled centuries, leaving us to piece together the truth from fragments, hints, and the faintest echoes of what once was. When the Roman Empire withdrew its legions from Britain around 410 in the Common Era, they left behind a province that had known 4 centuries of Roman peace, Roman roads, Roman law, and Roman protection, all of which vanished almost overnight like a dream upon waking. The Romano-British people, who had lived under the eagle standards for so long that they had forgotten how to defend themselves, suddenly found themselves alone in a world that was growing increasingly dangerous with each passing year. From across the North Sea came waves of Germanic peoples, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, land-hungry warriors who saw in Britain's weakened state an opportunity to carve out new kingdoms for themselves, bringing with them their own gods, their own languages, and their own brutal way of war. The Romano-British, clinging to their Christian faith and their fading memories of Roman civilization, fought back against these pagan invaders in a series of desperate struggles that would last for generations. Conflicts so devastating and transformative that they would reshape the entire island and give birth to what would eventually become England. Yet even in this darkness, there were moments of light, victories won against impossible odds, stands made that held back the tide, and leaders who inspired their followers to fight just one more battle, to hold just one more hill, to believe that somehow they might survive. The Romano-British were not conquered quickly, as the story of Arthur's age makes clear, for the Saxon advance across Britain took more than a century and a half, suggesting that somewhere, somehow, the British found the strength and leadership to resist, to slow the invasion, and to preserve their culture at least in the western parts of the island where Saxon control remained weak or non-existent for many generations. In this historical context of prolonged resistance, the idea of a great British war leader who won a series of victories against the Saxons becomes not just possible but probable. For how else could the British have held out so long against such determined and numerous enemies? The challenge for historians lies not in imagining that such a leader existed, but in connecting the fragmentary historical evidence to the legendary figure who would later be called Arthur, a name that means bear man or possibly derives from a Roman family name, Artorius, which some Romano-British families might well have carried into the post-Roman period. The transformation of a possible historical commander into the legendary King of Camelot represents one of the most dramatic evolutions in all of literature. A process that took centuries and involved contributions from Welsh bards, French poets, English chroniclers, and countless storytellers who each added their own layer to the tale, polishing it, expanding it, and ultimately obscuring whatever historical truth might have existed at its core. Chapter 2: The Earliest Whispers. The first mentions of Arthur in written sources come not from his own time, if he had a time, but from centuries later, fragments and references that historians must examine with the care of archaeologists brushing dust from ancient bones. The earliest potentially historical reference appears in a work called the Historia Britanniae, or History of the Britons, compiled around 830 by a Welsh monk named Nennius, who was writing more than 300 years after Arthur supposedly lived, making him about as far removed from his subject as we today are from the American Revolution. Nennius describes Arthur not as a king but as a dux bellorum, a leader of battles, who fought alongside the kings of the Britons against the Saxon invaders in a series of 12 victorious engagements, culminating in the Great Battle of Badon Hill, where Arthur personally killed 960 men in a single charge, a number so absurdly inflated that it immediately raises questions about the reliability of the entire account. Yet even if we dismiss the exaggerated body count as the product of poetic license or manuscript corruption, the core claim remains intriguing: that a British military leader won a significant victory at a place called Badon Hill, turning back the Saxon advance, at least temporarily. The problem is that while Nennius gives us Arthur's name and associates him with this crucial battle, another earlier source mentions the Battle of Badon without mentioning Arthur at all, creating one of the many puzzles that have frustrated Arthur scholars for generations. This earlier source is a work called De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae, or On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain, written by a British monk named Gildas around 540, which would place him within living memory of the events he describes if Arthur existed in the traditional time frame. Gildas writes about the Battle of Badon Hill as a great British victory that occurred in the year of his own birth, and he describes it as a turning point that brought a generation of peace. Yet remarkably, frustratingly, maddeningly for later historians, he never mentions anyone named Arthur in connection with this battle, or indeed anywhere else in his entire work. This silence has been interpreted in many ways over the centuries, with some scholars arguing that it proves Arthur never existed, while others suggest that Gildas might have had personal or political reasons for omitting Arthur's name, or that Arthur was so well known that Gildas saw no need to name him specifically, or that Arthur was actually one of the other leaders Gildas mentions but under a different name. The absence of Arthur from Gildas's account is particularly puzzling because Gildas was a contemporary or near contemporary of the supposed Arthur, writing within a generation or two of when these events occurred, giving his testimony far more weight than sources written centuries later. Yet if Arthur performed the great deeds later attributed to him, why would Gildas not mention him, especially in a work that criticizes various British leaders by name? Some scholars have suggested that Arthur might have been one of the leaders Gildas does mention, perhaps Ambrosius Aurelianus, a Romano-British commander who Gildas credits with organizing the British resistance and achieving victories against the Saxons. But this identification remains speculative and has not been widely accepted. Another early reference to Arthur appears in a 10th century Welsh text called the Annals Cambriae, or Welsh Annals, which claims to record events from the late 5th century onward, including 2 entries that mention Arthur. The first entry, dated to around 516, states the Battle of Badon, in which Arthur carried the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ for 3 days and 3 nights on his shoulders, and the Britons were the victors, while a second entry, dated to around 537, records the strife of Camelot, in which Arthur and Medrawd fell. These brief notes, if they reflect genuine historical memory rather than later additions to the chronicle, would place Arthur in the early 6th century and suggest that he died in a civil war against someone named Medrawd, who later tradition would transform into Mordred, Arthur's traitorous nephew or son. However, the Annals Cambri was compiled centuries after the events it describes, and scholars debate whether its early entries represent authentic historical records or whether they were constructed later based on legend and guesswork, meaning that even this seemingly concrete evidence for Arthur's existence must be treated with caution. The phrase about Arthur carrying the cross on his shoulders for 3 days and 3 nights has been interpreted as either a miraculous claim, a poetic description of Arthur bearing a Christian symbol into battle, or possibly a mistranslation of a Welsh word meaning shield rather than shoulders, suggesting that Arthur bore an image of Christ on his shield, which would be consistent with other accounts of Christian Romano-British warriors displaying their faith as they fought against pagan invaders. The Welsh poetic tradition preserves many references to Arthur that predate the more famous medieval romances, though dating these poems precisely remains extremely difficult. Works like Y Gododdin, attributed to the bard Aneurin and possibly composed around 600, contain passing references to warriors being praised as mighty in battle, though they were not Arthur, suggesting that even at this early date Arthur had become a standard of comparison for heroic prowess. Other early Welsh poems place Arthur in fantastical adventures, hunting magical boars, raiding the otherworld for a magical cauldron, and leading warriors with names that would later become famous in Arthurian legend. Though in these earliest versions the stories have a distinctly Celtic flavor, rooted in mythology and folklore rather than the chivalric romance that would later dominate Arthurian literature. The poem Pa Gur Yv y Porthor, or What Man is the Gatekeeper, which may date from the 9th or 10th century, presents Arthur in conversation with a gatekeeper, listing his companions and their exploits in a way that shows Arthur was already the center of a cycle of tales, though these tales were quite different from the refined court of Camelot that later audiences would imagine. These Welsh sources are invaluable because they show that Arthur was a figure of legend in Wales long before the medieval romances. But they also raise the question of whether the historical figure, if he existed, had already been so transformed by oral tradition that separating fact from fiction had become impossible even for people living only a few generations after his supposed lifetime. Chapter 3: The Geography of Legend. Understanding where Arthur might have operated, if he operated anywhere, requires a careful examination of the geography mentioned in early sources and the archaeological evidence from post-Roman Britain. The place names associated with Arthur stretch across the western and northern parts of Britain, from Cornwall in the southwest to Scotland in the north, suggesting either that Arthur's influence was remarkably widespread, that different regions claimed him as their own local hero, or that multiple historical figures were later conflated into a single legendary Arthur. The Battle of Badon Hill, mentioned as Arthur's greatest victory, has been placed by various scholars at no fewer than a dozen different locations across Britain, from Badbury Rings in Dorset to Bath in Somerset to Bowden Hill in Lincolnshire, with each proposed site having some geographic or etymological argument in its favor but none having conclusive proof. The Welsh name for the battle, Mynydd Bad Don, suggests a hill or mountain, and the tactical description of the battle as a siege might indicate a fortified hilltop position that the Saxons besieged and where Arthur, perhaps leading a relief force, inflicted a devastating defeat on the besiegers. But without knowing the precise location, we cannot verify this reconstruction against the actual terrain. Other battle sites attributed to Arthur by Nennius include places whose locations have been lost to time, or whose identifications remain hotly contested among scholars who have spent careers trying to match medieval Welsh names to modern British geography. Nennius lists the River Glane, the River Dubglas in the region of Linguist, the River Basses, the Caledonian Forest, Castle Gwynion, and the City of the Legion among Arthur's battle sites, names that have been tentatively connected to places as far north as Scotland and as far south as southern England, creating a military campaign that seems impossibly wide-ranging unless Arthur commanded mobile cavalry forces that could cover ground far more quickly than Saxon infantry could pursue. The geographical spread of Arthur's supposed battles has led some historians to suggest that the list compiled by Nennius actually represents victories won by multiple different commanders over several decades, all later attributed to Arthur as his legend grew, while others argue that the list might preserve a genuine memory of a coordinated Romano-British military campaign against Saxon settlements across a wide front. The mention of the Caledonian Forest, which lay in what is now Scotland, has inspired particular speculation because it places Arthur far to the north, in territory that was not threatened by Saxons but by Picts, the indigenous people of northern Britain whom even the Romans had never fully conquered, raising questions about whether Arthur fought on multiple fronts or whether some of these battles belonged to other leaders entirely. The location most strongly associated with Arthur in later tradition is Cornwall, particularly Tintagel, a dramatic clifftop site on the North Cornish coast where medieval ruins stand above crashing waves and where Geoffrey of Monmouth, writing in the 12th century, claimed Arthur was conceived through Merlin's magic. Archaeological excavations at Tintagel have revealed that it was indeed an important site in the post-Roman period, with evidence of high-status occupation, extensive trade connections with the Mediterranean world, and possible princely or royal residence during the exact centuries when Arthur supposedly lived. The discovery of a slate fragment at Tintagel bearing a Latin inscription that includes a name similar to Arthur, though not Arthur itself, caused tremendous excitement when it was found, suggesting to some that there might be a genuine connection between the site and the legendary king, though other scholars caution against reading too much into a single artifact. The later identification of Tintagel as Arthur's birthplace owes much to Geoffrey of Monmouth's imagination and the subsequent decision by medieval nobles, particularly Richard Earl of Cornwall in the 13th century, to rebuild Tintagel Castle in a deliberately Arthurian style to connect their own authority to the legendary king, a process that has made it difficult to separate genuine historical associations from later Romantic inventions. Cornwall's claim to Arthur is strengthened by the region's strong Celtic cultural continuity, as Cornwall remained British-speaking and culturally distinct from Saxon England for centuries, preserving traditions that might include memories of historical events later incorporated into the Arthur legend. The other major geographical claim comes from Wales, where place names associated with Arthur are scattered across the landscape, from Dinas Emrys, where Merlin supposedly prophesied to Caerleon, where Arthur's court was sometimes placed in early Welsh tradition. Wales has a particularly strong claim to preserving the earliest Arthur traditions, as the Welsh language is the direct descendant of the Brittonic language spoken in post-Roman Britain, and Welsh literature contains some of the oldest references to Arthur in existence. The Welsh triads, collections of traditional lore grouped in threes for memorization, mention Arthur repeatedly, placing him in a purely Welsh context quite different from the later Anglo-Norman romances, and suggesting that he was integral to Welsh cultural memory long before English writers took an interest in him. The landscape of Wales is dotted with Arthurian associations. Hills called Arthur's Chair, stones called Arthur's Stone, caves where Arthur and his knights supposedly sleep awaiting Britain's hour of greatest need. Place names that suggest folk memory has long connected these locations with the legendary king. Yet the very abundance of Arthurian place names across Wales, Cornwall, and even Brittany in France, where British refugees carried their culture and legends after fleeing Saxon conquest, raises the question of whether these represent genuine historical memory or whether they arose later as the legend grew in popularity and communities sought to claim a connection to the famous king. The scholarly debate over Arthur's geography mirrors the larger debate over his existence. Every piece of evidence can be interpreted either as proof of a historical figure whose memory persisted in specific locations or as evidence of a legend that spread across the landscape. attaching itself to ancient sites and giving them new meaning in the process. Chapter 4: The Archaeological Evidence. Archaeology has played an increasingly important role in the search for the historical Arthur, though it is important to understand what archaeology can and cannot tell us about a possible individual who left no inscriptions, no identified burial, and no personal artifacts that we can definitively connect to him. What archaeology can show us is what life was like in post-Roman Britain during the period when Arthur supposedly lived, allowing us to test whether the historical context would have permitted someone like Arthur to exist and to achieve the deeds attributed to him. Excavations across Britain have revealed a society in transition, with Roman civilization collapsing but not disappearing overnight, with some communities trying desperately to maintain Roman lifestyles while others adapted to new realities, and with defensive structures being built, rebuilt, and refortified as communities prepared for conflict. The archaeological picture is complex, varied, and regionally diverse, with some areas showing continued prosperity and Mediterranean trade connections well into the 6th century, while other regions show rapid decline, abandonment of Roman sites, and a return to simpler, more self-sufficient ways of life that left fewer material traces for modern excavators to find. One of the most significant archaeological investigations connected to Arthur was conducted at South Cadbury Hill Fort in Somerset, a massive Iron Age fortification that was spectacularly refortified in the late 5th or early 6th century, exactly when Arthur supposedly lived. The excavations, led by archaeologist Leslie Alcock in the 1960s, revealed that someone with considerable resources and authority had rebuilt the ancient defenses of this hilltop stronghold, creating a fortress capable of housing a war band of significant size, with a great hall at the summit that could have served as the center of a warrior aristocracy. The scale and sophistication of the refortification work at Cadbury suggests a powerful leader with the ability to mobilize substantial labor and resources, exactly the kind of figure that a historical Arthur would have been, and local tradition has long identified Cadbury with Camelot, though this association became explicit only in the 16th century when the antiquarian John Leland recorded that local people called the site Camelot and believed it was Arthur's famous stronghold. The archaeological evidence cannot prove that Arthur personally occupied Cadbury, but it does prove that someone of considerable power and ambition was active in Somerset in the right time period, maintaining Romano-British military traditions including cavalry warfare, as suggested by the discovery of equipment associated with horses and riders. The Cadbury excavations demonstrated that the late 5th and early 6th centuries were not entirely dark, that Romano-British culture retained pockets of sophistication and military organization, and that the historical context would have allowed for figures of Arthur's legendary stature to exist, even if we cannot name them with certainty. Other archaeological sites have added to our understanding of post-Roman Britain and the possible context for Arthur's existence. The hill forts of Wales and the southwest, many of which were reoccupied during the 5th and 6th centuries after being abandoned for centuries, show a pattern of communities seeking defensible positions, suggesting ongoing military threat and the need for protected gathering places. Excavations at sites like Dinah's Powys in Wales have revealed high-status occupation with evidence of feasting, metalworking, and imported Mediterranean pottery, suggesting that some British leaders maintained not just military power but also the wealth and trade connections to display their status through expensive foreign goods. The presence of Mediterranean pottery at British sites in the early 6th century, centuries after the end of Roman rule, demonstrates that maritime trade networks persisted and that British elites were still connected to the wider world, paying for luxury goods with whatever resources they controlled, possibly tin from Cornwall or other mineral wealth. This archaeological evidence paints a picture of post-Roman Britain that is more complex than simple decline, showing instead a society trying to adapt, to survive, and to maintain elements of the culture it had known. A society that would have needed military leaders, that would have celebrated victories against foreign invaders, and that would have had every reason to create heroic legends around its successful commanders. The search for Arthur's grave has inspired numerous archaeological investigations, most famously at Glastonbury Abbey in Somerset, where monks claimed in 1191 to have discovered the tombs of Arthur and Guinevere, conveniently finding them at a time when the abbey needed money for rebuilding after a devastating fire. The monks reported discovering a massive coffin made from a hollowed oak log, buried deep in the abbey grounds, containing the bones of an exceptionally tall man and a woman, along with a lead cross inscribed with the Latin words, "Here lies buried the famous King Arthur in the Isle of Avalon," a find that instantly transformed Glastonbury into a pilgrimage site and brought the abbey considerable revenue. Modern scholars are virtually unanimous in regarding the Glastonbury discovery as a medieval forgery, a pious fraud designed to boost the abbey's prestige and income by connecting it to the legendary king, though the monks may have genuinely believed they had found something significant even if their interpretation was shaped by wishful thinking and economic necessity. The lead cross, which survived until the 18th century before disappearing, was examined by scholars who concluded from its lettering style that it dated to the 10th or 11th century at the earliest, far too late to be contemporary with a 6th century Arthur, though it might represent an earlier tradition at Glastonbury connecting the site to Arthur before the monks' convenient discovery. The episode illustrates both the enduring power of Arthurian legend and the difficulties in using archaeological evidence to prove or disprove Arthur's existence, as the material remains are always subject to interpretation, reinterpretation, and sometimes deliberate manipulation by people with religious, political, or economic motivations. Chapter 5: The Roman Connection. To understand Arthur's possible historical identity, we must examine the Roman military tradition that would have shaped any Romano-British commander of the late 5th or early 6th century. For if Arthur existed, he existed at a unique moment when Roman military knowledge had not yet been entirely forgotten but could no longer be reinforced by the empire that had created it. The Romans had occupied Britain for nearly 4 centuries, from the invasion launched by Emperor Claudius in 43 of the Common Era until the final withdrawal of regular Roman troops around 410, a period longer than the entire history of the United States, long enough for Roman civilization to take deep root among the native British population. The Romano-British were not simply conquered subjects but had become Roman in their culture, their language, their religion after the empire converted to Christianity, and their sense of identity, producing from their own population senators, officials, bishops, and military officers who saw themselves as Romans and who desperately tried to maintain their Roman way of life even after the empire abandoned them. The Roman military had introduced to Britain concepts of organized warfare, strategic defense, and cavalry tactics that would have seemed revolutionary to the earlier British tribes. And it is precisely these Roman military innovations that someone like Arthur would have needed to use to defeat the Saxon invaders who fought in their traditional Germanic style of infantry shield walls. The hypothesis that Arthur was a cavalry commander, using mounted warriors to strike fast and hard against Saxon infantry, has become central to many historical reconstructions of who Arthur might have been if he existed. The Romans had developed effective cavalry tactics over centuries of warfare, and while Britain had never been the most cavalry-oriented of Roman provinces, there were Roman cavalry units stationed there, and Romano-British aristocrats would have been familiar with horses and riding as marks of status and power. After the Roman withdrawal, a commander who could organize and equip a mobile force of cavalry would have possessed an enormous tactical advantage over Saxon war bands that traveled on foot and fought in relatively static infantry formations, allowing him to choose when and where to fight, to strike at supply lines and scattered settlements, and to appear seemingly anywhere along a frontier that stretched hundreds of miles. This military hypothesis fits well with Nennius's description of Arthur as a leader of battles rather than a king, suggesting a war leader who fought alongside multiple British kingdoms without ruling any of them himself, a position that would make sense for a cavalry commander who could move between different British territories, reinforcing them as needed and coordinating a mobile defense that no single kingdom could mount alone. The use of cavalry would also explain how Arthur could fight battles across the wide geographic range mentioned in the sources, covering distances that would be impossible for infantry-based armies but manageable for mounted forces. The strongest case for Arthur as a Roman-style cavalry commander connects him to a Roman military unit called the Sarmatian cavalry, armored horsemen from the steppes of Eastern Europe who served in the Roman army and were stationed in Britain in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. These Sarmatians brought with them distinctive customs, including the worship of a sword thrust into the ground, dragon standards carried into battle, and heavily armored cavalry tactics that influenced Roman military practice. A small group of scholars has argued that the Sarmatian presence in Britain, particularly at a fort called Bremetenicum in what is now Lancashire, could have left cultural traces that influenced later Arthurian legend, including the famous sword Excalibur, the dragon symbol associated with British resistance, and the emphasis on mounted warfare. The theory goes further to suggest that a Romano-British commander of the late 5th century might have consciously modeled himself and his warband on the Sarmatian tradition, seeing in these exotic Eastern warriors a template for the kind of elite strike force needed to combat the Saxons, and that this connection was preserved in legend even as its historical origins were forgotten. This is a controversial hypothesis that many mainstream historians view with skepticism, seeing it as an attempt to find historical origins for legendary details that might be entirely fictional. Yet it illustrates how scholars have tried to connect the militaristic aspects of Arthur's legend to real Roman military practices that could have existed in post-Roman Britain. The Roman name Artorius has also played a role in attempts to identify Arthur, as it is a genuine Roman family name that could plausibly have been carried by Romano-British families after the Roman withdrawal. The most often cited historical Artorius is Lucius Artorius Castus, a Roman officer of the 2nd century who commanded Sarmatian cavalry in Britain and campaigned in Gaul, though he lived 3 centuries before the traditional date for Arthur and thus could not be the Arthur of legend unless we assume the legends are about a historical figure from a much earlier period than traditionally thought. Some scholars have suggested that the story of Lucius Artorius Castus might have been preserved in folk memory and later updated to the post-Roman period, or that a descendant of Artorius, carrying the family name, became the historical kernel around which the Arthur legends formed, making the literary Arthur a composite of multiple historical figures spanning several centuries. The Roman connection remains attractive to historians because it explains both Arthur's military success, based on superior Roman tactical knowledge, and his role as a defender of civilization against barbarism, mirroring Rome's self-image as a beacon of culture surrounded by savage peoples, an ideology that Romano-British Christians would have eagerly embraced as they fought pagan Saxon invaders. Whether Arthur was Roman in name, in training, in equipment, or in inspiration, any historical Arthur would have been a product of the Roman centuries in Britain, fighting to preserve the last fragments of Roman civilization against a future that had no place for Rome or its values. Chapter 6. The Welsh Tradition. Long before English writers made Arthur into an international literary phenomenon, he belonged to the Welsh, or more accurately to the Celtic-speaking peoples of Britain who preserved their language and culture in Wales, Cornwall, and Brittany after the Saxons conquered what would become England. The Welsh poetic and prose tradition contains some of the earliest and strangest Arthurian material, presenting Arthur in a context radically different from the chivalric romances that most people know today, a context rooted in Celtic mythology, native British history, and a worldview where the boundary between the human and the supernatural remained fluid and permeable. In early Welsh literature, Arthur is both a heroic war leader and a figure of magic and wonder, raiding the otherworld for mystical treasures, hunting supernatural animals, and commanding warriors whose exploits verge on the mythological, suggesting that even in these earliest surviving texts the historical figure, if there was one, had already been transformed by centuries of oral storytelling into something larger than life. The Welsh Arthur is a giant killer, a monster slayer, a man of violence and power who protects his people not through the refined courtesy of later chivalric tradition, but through raw martial prowess and cunning, presenting an Arthur who would have been far more recognizable to warriors of the Dark Ages than the courtly king of medieval romance. The collection of medieval Welsh tales known as the Mabinogion includes several stories featuring Arthur, though he often appears as a supporting character in tales centered on other heroes, suggesting that he was part of a larger cycle of British legend rather than the sole focus of the tradition. In the tale of Culhwch and Olwen, Arthur is portrayed as a powerful king whose court includes warriors with fantastical abilities, men who can hear ants stirring 50 miles away, who can flatten forests with their breath, who possess magical attributes that make them useful for the impossible tasks that Culhwch must accomplish to win his bride. This Arthur commands respect and fear, casually executing warriors who offend him, leading his men on monster hunts, and treating the supernatural as a normal part of his world. A very different figure from the thoughtful, sometimes tragic king of later tradition who struggles with moral dilemmas and complex political situations. The Welsh tales preserve a sense of Arthur as a hero from a mythic age when giants walked the earth, when magical cauldrons could restore the dead to life, and when the boundaries of the human world extended into realms of pure imagination, making it clear that whatever historical basis Arthur might have had, the Celtic imagination had long since transformed him into something that transcended ordinary history. These stories were not written down until the Middle Ages, but they contain elements that seem to reach back to very ancient British tradition, suggesting continuous oral transmission from the Dark Ages through the centuries until scribes finally captured them in manuscript form. The Welsh triads, which organized traditional knowledge into groups of 3 for easier memorization, repeatedly mention Arthur, listing his 3 great queens, his 3 chief elders, his 3 battle horsemen, and many other groups of 3 associated with his court and his time. These triads show that Arthur was central to Welsh historical memory or pseudo-historical memory, treated as a fixed point around which other characters and events could be organized, much as later English history would organize itself around the Norman conquest or the reign of Elizabeth I. The triads present Arthur as a king, not merely a war leader, giving him a wife named Gwenhwyfar, who is usually identified with Guinevere, and placing him in conflicts with other British leaders, including civil wars that would ultimately destroy his kingdom, themes that later writers would develop into the familiar story of Camelot's fall. The Welsh tradition consistently portrays Arthur as a British hero specifically opposed to the Saxons, making him a symbol of Welsh resistance against English conquest, a role that the historical memory of Arthur, if he existed, would naturally have assumed as the Welsh defined their identity in opposition to the English who had taken most of Britain from their ancestors. This political dimension of Arthur's legend has been present from the earliest times, making him not just a story but a statement about identity, resistance, and the refusal to forget that Britain was British before it was English. The Welsh also preserve traditions about Arthur's companions and court that differ significantly from the later Round Table knights familiar to modern audiences. In Welsh tradition, Arthur's chief warrior is often Kai, better known by his French name Kay, but in Welsh stories Kai is not the somewhat comical figure of later romance but a formidable fighter with supernatural abilities, including the power to hold his breath for 9 days underwater and to grow as tall as a tree when he wished, magical attributes that locate these stories firmly in the realm of myth rather than history. Another important Welsh Arthurian figure is Bedwyr, better known as Bedivere, who like Kai appears in some of the earliest references to Arthur, and who in Welsh tradition is Arthur's companion in fantastical adventures, far removed from the more human character of later English and French tales. The Welsh tradition also includes characters and stories that the later romances would largely ignore, including tales of Arthur's conflicts with saints, his hunting of magical animals, and his interactions with the indigenous peoples of Britain, stories that did not fit the courtly romance template, but which reveal the deeper, stranger roots of Arthurian tradition. Some Welsh tales portray Arthur in a negative light, as a tyrant or a fool, suggesting that Welsh tradition about Arthur was not uniformly positive, perhaps preserving different political perspectives from different regions or different time periods, or reflecting the complexity of oral tradition which could hold contradictory versions of the same character without seeing any need to reconcile them into a single consistent portrait. Chapter 7. Geoffrey of Monmouth's Revolution. The transformation of Arthur from a figure of Welsh legend and fragmentary historical reference into an international literary phenomenon began in 1138, when a Welsh cleric named Geoffrey of Monmouth completed his Historia Regum Britanniae, or History of the Kings of Britain, a work that would reshape Arthurian tradition so completely that nearly everything people think they know about Arthur today derives directly or indirectly from Geoffrey's creative imagination. Geoffrey claimed to be translating an ancient book in the British language that contained the true history of the British kings from the legendary Brutus, who supposedly founded Britain after fleeing from Troy, down to the 7th century. But historians have long concluded that this ancient book never existed and that Geoffrey invented most of his history, drawing on Welsh traditions, some genuine historical knowledge, and a great deal of creative fiction to produce what is essentially historical fantasy presented as fact. In Geoffrey's telling, Arthur is not merely a war leader but a great king who conquers most of Europe, defeats the Roman Empire, and creates a magnificent court that becomes the center of civilization, transforming the Welsh hero into a figure of imperial grandeur that would have appealed to Geoffrey's Anglo-Norman audience, who were themselves conquerors trying to legitimize their rule over Britain by connecting themselves to its ancient past. Geoffrey's Arthur is born at Tintagel through Merlin's magic, pulls the sword from the stone to prove his right to kingship, wields the sword Caliban which was forged in the Isle of Avalon, gathers the greatest knights in the world to his court, marries Ganhumera who will betray him, and ultimately falls in battle against his nephew Mordred, dying but not dead, carried away to Avalon to heal his wounds, leaving behind the promise that he will return when Britain needs him most. The impact of Geoffrey's history on medieval literature and culture cannot be overstated, for within a generation of its composition it had been translated from Latin into French and Welsh, had spread across Europe, and had inspired countless other writers to elaborate on the stories and characters Geoffrey introduced or expanded. Geoffrey gave Arthur's story a clear narrative structure with a beginning, middle, and tragic end, transforming the fragmentary Welsh traditions into something resembling a coherent biography, even if that biography was largely fictional. He introduced or popularized characters who would become central to Arthurian tradition, including Merlin the magician, who Geoffrey drew from Welsh tales of a mad prophet but reinvented as Arthur's advisor and the architect of his conception, making Merlin integral to Arthur's story in a way he had not been before. Geoffrey's version of Arthur's rise to power, through the miracle of the sword in the stone that could only be drawn by the rightful king, provided a dramatic scene of legitimation that later writers would elaborate into the famous story of the young Arthur proving his destiny, though Geoffrey's version is much simpler than later retellings would make it. The tragedy of Arthur's fall, destroyed by his beloved nephew's betrayal and his wife's infidelity, gave the story an emotional power and moral complexity that elevated it beyond simple heroic adventure, creating a narrative of paradise lost, of a golden age destroyed by human weakness and sin, a theme that would resonate through centuries of Arthurian literature and connect Arthur's story to universal human experiences of loss and regret. Geoffrey of Monmouth was writing at a specific historical moment that shaped his version of Arthur in important ways. He lived under Norman rule, a century after William the Conqueror had invaded England, at a time when the Norman aristocracy was consolidating its power and searching for ways to legitimize its rule over the conquered Saxons and the marginalized Welsh. By presenting Arthur as a great British king who had conquered the Saxons and established an empire, Geoffrey created a usable past that all parties could embrace, giving the Welsh a hero who validated their historical importance, giving the English a legendary king more magnificent than anything from their Saxon past, and giving the Norman rulers a precedent for British imperial greatness that they could claim to be restoring. Geoffrey's Arthur fights against the Saxons but also against the Romans, making him a figure of British independence and power who had defeated all the foreign conquerors that the real Britain had failed to defeat, creating a fantasy of British greatness that was particularly appealing at a time when Britain had been conquered repeatedly and was currently under Norman French rule. The political utility of Geoffrey's Arthur helped ensure his work's success and its rapid spread, as different audiences found different reasons to embrace this vision of British history, whether as inspiration, as propaganda, or as entertainment. Modern historians recognize that Geoffrey's history tells us far more about the 12th century when it was written than about the 6th century it claims to describe, but as a work of literature and as a cultural force, it is immensely important, creating the template from which almost all later Arthurian tradition would develop. The historical community of Geoffrey's own time was divided about his work, with some writers accepting it as genuine history while others recognized it as fiction. William of Newburgh, writing later in the 12th century, denounced Geoffrey's work as lies and fantasies, criticizing his fellow historian for deceiving his audience with invented stories. But despite such criticism, Geoffrey's version of British history became widely accepted in medieval Europe, copied into chronicle after chronicle, translated into multiple languages, and treated as authoritative by audiences who wanted to believe in Arthur's greatness regardless of whether every detail could be verified. Geoffrey's success demonstrates the power of a good story to overcome historical skepticism, as his vivid, detailed, and emotionally compelling narrative displaced the fragmentary and contradictory earlier traditions about Arthur, becoming the definitive version simply by virtue of being the most complete and satisfying account available. Later writers would add to Geoffrey's foundation, changing details, introducing new characters and adventures, and eventually creating the vast body of Arthurian romance that filled the Middle Ages. But Geoffrey's core narrative structure, Arthur's magical conception, his rise to power, his glorious reign, and his tragic fall, would remain the backbone of Arthurian tradition for centuries. In giving Arthur a coherent story, Geoffrey also made him more than merely British, transforming him into a universal figure whose adventures could be appreciated by anyone, anywhere, regardless of their connection to Britain or knowledge of its history. And in doing so, Geoffrey ensured that Arthur would survive long after the historical questions about his existence had been thoroughly confused by layer upon layer of literary invention. Chapter 8. The matter of Britain expands. After Geoffrey of Monmouth opened the floodgates, Arthurian literature exploded across medieval Europe in what scholars call the matter of Britain, one of the three great cycles of medieval literature, along with the matter of Rome dealing with classical antiquity and the matter of France dealing with Charlemagne and his paladins. French poets in particular seized upon Arthur's story and transformed it, adding the element of courtly love, introducing knights like Lancelot who had not appeared in Geoffrey's work, and shifting the focus from Arthur himself to the adventures of his knights, creating the romance tradition that would dominate Arthurian literature for the rest of the Middle Ages and beyond. The French poet Chrétien de Troyes, writing in the late 12th century, produced 5 major Arthurian romances that introduced or popularized many elements now considered essential to the legend, including the love affair between Lancelot and Guinevere, which would become the central tragedy alongside Arthur's conflict with Mordred. Chrétien's romances were not histories but conscious fictions, adventures of knights errant who rode out from Arthur's court to prove themselves through combat, to rescue ladies, to pursue mystical quests, and to navigate the complex code of chivalry that governed aristocratic behavior in the High Middle Ages, even though this code would have been completely foreign to any 6th century British war leader. The French romances transformed Camelot into an idealized medieval court that reflected the values and concerns of 12th and 13th century aristocrats, making Arthur's kingdom into a mirror where the nobility could see their own aspirations, their own social structures, and their own anxieties about love, loyalty, and honor reflected back at them in heightened, dramatized form. Chrétien de Troyes also introduced the quest for the Holy Grail into Arthurian tradition, though he died before completing his Grail romance, leaving it to later writers to explain what the Grail was and what finding it meant. The Grail quest would become one of the most important and influential elements of Arthurian legend, transforming the stories from primarily military and courtly adventures into spiritual allegories where the knight's true battle was against his own sins and the ultimate goal was not earthly glory but divine grace. Later medieval writers, particularly those writing from religious perspectives, developed the Grail story into a complex Christian mystery, identifying the Grail as the cup Christ used at the Last Supper and sometimes also as the vessel that caught his blood at the crucifixion, making it the most sacred object in Christendom and thus the worthiest goal for Arthur's knights to pursue. The Grail quest introduced the character of Galahad, the perfect knight whose purity allowed him to achieve the Grail where all others failed, providing a model of Christian virtue that contrasted with the more worldly knights like Lancelot, whose sins prevented them from completing the quest. The Grail tradition shows how Arthurian legend could be adapted to serve different purposes, in this case transforming warrior heroes into spiritual seekers and using their adventures to explore theological questions about sin, redemption, perfection, and the relationship between earthly and divine love, themes that had little to do with the historical questions about a possible 6th century British war leader, but everything to do with the concerns of medieval Christian culture. German poets also embraced Arthurian material, with Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival offering a particularly elaborate version of the Grail quest that incorporated elements of Islamic culture and learning, reflecting the medieval German experience of the Crusades and contact with the sophisticated civilizations of the Middle East. The spread of Arthurian literature across Europe demonstrated its universal appeal, as each culture adapted the stories to reflect their own values and concerns while maintaining the core characters and situations that Geoffrey and the early romancers had established. In Spain, in Italy, in the Netherlands, in Scandinavia, poets and prose writers produced Arthurian works, translating existing romances and creating new ones, ensuring that by the late Middle Ages Arthur was as familiar to educated Europeans as any figure from classical mythology or Christian history, and far more popular than most. The sheer volume of medieval Arthurian literature is staggering, with hundreds of poems, prose romances, and chronicles written over several centuries, creating a body of work so vast that no single person could read it all in a lifetime, and creating such a complex web of stories, characters, and adventures that different texts often contradicted each other about even basic details, as each author felt free to adapt the tradition to suit their own artistic purposes. This literary proliferation had the effect of burying whatever historical truth might have existed about Arthur under so many layers of fictional invention that recovering the original became effectively impossible, as separating the earliest traditions from later editions required detective work that would challenge scholars for centuries. The medieval Arthur also appeared in chronicles and histories that treated him as a genuine historical figure, with his story incorporated into the narrative of British history as matter-of-factly as William the Conqueror or Edward I. Medieval historians generally did not distinguish between history and legend in the way modern historians do, and they saw no contradiction in placing Arthur in the historical narrative alongside figures whose existence was well documented, treating Geoffrey of Monmouth's inventions as reliable sources for the distant past. This medieval acceptance of Arthur's historicity meant that for centuries he was a figure of both literature and history, a character in romances and also a supposed ancestor of contemporary kings, giving the literary Arthur a cultural weight and political significance that purely fictional characters like Odysseus or Aeneas did not possess in the same way. English kings in particular had reasons to promote belief in Arthur's historical existence, as they could claim to be Arthur's successors, to be fulfilling ancient prophecies about his return, or to be restoring the glories of his reign, all of which enhanced their own legitimacy and authority. King Edward I even claimed to have found Arthur's crown and presented it as a relic, asserting his connection to the legendary king and using Arthur's memory to support English claims to rule over Wales and Scotland, turning the ancient legend into a tool of medieval imperialism. The political uses of Arthur show that the question of his historical existence was never purely academic but always carried implications for contemporary power struggles, as different groups claimed Arthur's legacy to support their own ambitions and to challenge their enemies' legitimacy. Chapter 9: The Death and Rebirth of Arthur. After dominating medieval literature and culture for centuries, Arthurian romance fell out of fashion during the Renaissance as humanist scholars turned their attention to classical Greek and Roman texts, and as religious reformers criticized medieval romance as frivolous and even immoral, filled with adultery, violence, and magic that distracted readers from proper Christian devotion. The printing press, which made books far more available than they had been in the manuscript age, initially helped spread Arthurian literature to a wider audience, with Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, printed by William Caxton in 1485, becoming the definitive English version of the Arthurian story, gathering together material from various French and English sources into a single comprehensive narrative that told Arthur's story from birth to death. Malory's work appeared at the very end of the medieval period, and it represented both a culmination of the medieval Arthurian tradition and its final major expression before the long decline, for after Malory, serious writers largely abandoned Arthur for the next 3.5 centuries. The Renaissance valued classical models over medieval ones, preferring the clear rationality of Greek philosophy and Roman rhetoric to the fantastical adventures and complex allegories of medieval romance. And this shift in literary taste meant that Arthurian stories came to be seen as old-fashioned, suited for children perhaps, but not for serious adult readers. The scientific revolution and the Enlightenment further damaged Arthur's reputation, as their emphasis on reason, evidence, and skepticism toward traditional authority extended to questioning legends and myths, including the legend of Arthur, which increasingly came under scholarly attack as critics demanded evidence for his existence and found the historical record wanting. By the 18th century, Arthur had largely disappeared from high culture, reduced to children's stories and antiquarian curiosity, while serious writers ignored him in favor of classical subjects or contemporary realism. The historical questions about Arthur became more pressing during this period as scholars developed more rigorous methods for evaluating sources and distinguishing genuine history from legend, with the emerging consensus being that Arthur was either entirely fictional or so obscured by legend that nothing reliable could be said about him. Some scholars argued for Arthur's existence based on the early Welsh sources, while others dismissed all Arthurian material as fabrication. But increasingly, the academic world treated Arthur as a problem in early medieval history rather than as a significant cultural figure, reversing centuries of assumed historicity. The loss of faith in Arthur's historical existence did not immediately translate into renewed literary interest, for the Victorian era initially continued to see Arthurian material as outdated medieval fantasy, unsuited to the industrial age and the growing British Empire that was creating its own contemporary heroes and narratives. The turning point came with the Romantic movement's revival of interest in the Middle Ages, as poets and artists sought alternatives to what they saw as the soulless materialism of industrial society, and found in medieval culture a world of beauty, spirituality, and heroism that the modern world seemed to lack. Alfred Lord Tennyson's Idylls of the King, published in installments between 1859 and 1885, brought Arthur back to cultural prominence, reimagining Malory's stories for a Victorian audience and transforming Arthur into a figure of Victorian moral idealism. a perfect gentleman and a Christian king whose court represented order and civilization threatened by chaos and sin. Tennyson's Arthur is not the warrior of Geoffrey of Monmouth or even the chivalric King of Malory, but a Victorian paternal figure, dignified, restrained, and ultimately tragic, betrayed by his best friend and his beloved wife, watching his ideals collapse around him as human weakness destroys everything he built. Tennyson's work was immensely popular and influential, inspiring a wider Victorian revival of Arthurian literature, art, and culture that made Arthur a symbol of English national identity at the height of British imperial power. Though this identification was somewhat ironic given that the historical Arthur, if he existed, fought against the English ancestors, the Saxons. The Victorian Arthur was pressed into service as a model of masculine virtue, of Christian devotion, of noble leadership, and of tragic heroism, values the Victorian middle and upper classes wanted to promote, and the legend was thoroughly sanitized to remove elements that might seem too violent, too sexual, or too fantastical for respectable Victorian tastes. The pre-Raphaelite artists, including Dante Gabriel Rossetti, William Morris, and Edward Burne-Jones, created paintings and designs based on Arthurian themes, contributing to the Victorian medieval revival and helping to shape how both the Victorians and later generations would visualize Arthur's world, with their romantic, detailed, and symbolically rich images becoming the default visual vocabulary for Arthurian subjects. The early 20th century saw continued literary interest in Arthur, with writers like T.H. White producing new versions of the legend that both honored the medieval tradition and subjected it to modern psychological and political analysis. White's The Once and Future King, published in parts from 1938 to 1958, presented Arthur as a well-meaning idealist trying to replace the old system of might makes right with a new order based on justice and law, only to see his grand experiment fail because he could not change human nature, a theme with obvious relevance to 20th century political idealism and its failures. White's work, particularly the first volume, The Sword in the Stone, became enormously popular and influenced later Arthurian adaptations, including the Disney animated film and the Broadway musical Camelot, which in turn influenced American political culture when journalists compared John F. Kennedy's presidency to Camelot, creating a mythology around Kennedy that borrowed Arthur's tragic glamour and idealistic vision. The late 20th and early 21st centuries have seen an explosion of Arthurian material in every medium, from novels that retell the legend from different perspectives to films that range from the historically grounded to the wildly fantastical. From scholarly works that continue to debate Arthur's historical existence to popular histories that bring the debate to general audiences. Arthur has proven remarkably adaptable, capable of being reimagined for every new generation, serving as a feminist icon in retellings from Guinevere's or Morgan's perspective, as a symbol of Celtic resistance in Welsh and Cornish nationalism, as a figure of mystical spirituality in neo-pagan movements, and as pure entertainment in fantasy adventures that use the familiar characters and situations as a starting point for new creative inventions. Chapter 10: The Scholarly Debate. The academic debate over Arthur's historical existence has continued for more than 2 centuries, producing a vast scholarly literature that ranges from careful analysis of the limited evidence to speculative reconstructions that try to identify Arthur with various historical figures or to explain how the legend developed without a historical basis. The scholarly community is deeply divided on the question, with some historians convinced that there was a historical Arthur, however different from the legend, while others argue that the evidence is insufficient to prove anyone resembling Arthur existed, and that the legend can be adequately explained as the product of mythology, folk tradition, and literary invention without requiring a historical founder. The debate is complicated by the nature of the evidence, which is fragmentary, late, and often contradictory, forcing scholars to make judgment calls about which sources are reliable, which can be trusted, and how to interpret mentions of Arthur that might be historical references later additions to historical texts, or purely legendary material that happened to be written down at an early date. The fact that Arthur first appears in sources written centuries after he supposedly lived means that even the earliest references to him might already be legend rather than history, as oral tradition could have transformed a historical figure beyond recognition within a few generations, or could have created a figure out of whole cloth and then projected him back into history. The optimistic view of Arthur's historicity argues that the pattern of early references, while not conclusive, is consistent with a historical figure who achieved fame in his own time and whose memory was preserved in Welsh tradition before being elaborated into legend. Scholars who accept Arthur's existence point to Gildas's mention of the Battle of Badon Hill as a genuine historical event, dated to around 500, and argue that the later attribution of this victory to Arthur in sources like Nennius and the Annals Cambrii likely preserves an authentic tradition even if the details have been embellished. They argue that the complete invention of Arthur seems unlikely given that he appears consistently in Welsh tradition as a figure of the post-Roman period, and that while later writers added fantastical elements, there remains a core of military and historical tradition that probably stems from a real person. Some scholars attempt to identify Arthur with known historical figures, suggesting he might have been a different name or title for someone mentioned in the sparse historical records, or they try to reconstruct his career based on the battle list in Nennius, arguing that while the list contains errors and exaggerations, it might preserve a genuine memory of where a British commander fought. The argument for a historical Arthur ultimately rests on the idea that legends usually have some basis in reality, that entirely fictional characters rarely become embedded in historical tradition so thoroughly, and that the alternative explanation requires us to believe in a remarkably elaborate and consistent invention by early medieval Welsh storytellers who created a figure from nothing and then convinced everyone he was historical. The skeptical view argues that the evidence for Arthur is too weak, too late, and too contaminated by legend to support claims of historicity, and that we should not assume Arthur existed simply because people in the Middle Ages believed he did. Skeptics point out that Gildas, our earliest source for the post-Roman period, does not mention Arthur at all despite describing the period when Arthur supposedly lived and the battle where he supposedly won his greatest victory, suggesting that Arthur was not actually the important figure later tradition claimed. They argue that the name Arthur appears in later Welsh sources not as history but as legend, as part of the same mythological tradition that places Arthur raiding the otherworld and hunting magical beasts, and that we have no way to separate a possibly historical Arthur from the obviously mythological one since they appear together in the same sources. The skeptical view suggests that Arthur might be a mythological figure, perhaps derived from older Celtic deities or heroes, who was historicized by being placed in the post-Roman period and associated with the Battle of Badon Hill, rather than being a historical figure who was mythologized. This view points to similar processes in other cultures where mythological heroes become treated as historical, such as with the Greek heroes of the Trojan War, who may have had some historical basis but whose stories as we have them are so mixed with mythology that separating history from fiction is impossible. Skeptics argue that the burden of proof lies with those claiming Arthur existed, and that in the absence of contemporary evidence or reliable historical testimony, we should accept that we simply do not know whether Arthur was real, and that it is more honest to admit ignorance than to construct elaborate theories based on insufficient evidence. A middle position, increasingly popular among scholars, suggests that while a single historical Arthur matching the legend probably did not exist, there may have been one or more British military leaders whose exploits formed the basis for the legends, leaders whose names we might never know, but whose victories against the Saxons were real and significant. This view accepts that the Battle of Badon Hill probably occurred and represented a major British victory, but remains agnostic about whether anyone named Arthur led the British forces, suggesting that the victory might have been won by Ambrosius Aurelianus, or by multiple commanders working together, or by someone whose name was lost and replaced by the legendary Arthur in later tradition. This moderate position acknowledges both the reasonable arguments for some historical basis to the Arthur legends and the very real problems with the evidence, trying to steer between credulous acceptance and total skepticism. It also emphasizes that the question of whether Arthur existed is actually less interesting and less important than understanding the world in which he supposedly lived and the process by which the legends developed, for these historical and cultural questions can be explored regardless of whether Arthur was real. The debate over Arthur's existence is unlikely ever to be fully resolved unless some extraordinary archaeological discovery produces contemporary evidence that settles the question. And given that such evidence has not emerged after more than a century of intensive archaeological work in Britain, most scholars believe we must live with uncertainty, treating Arthur as a fascinating problem rather than as a question with a definitive answer. Chapter 11. The archaeological investigations continue. Throughout the 20th and into the 21st century, archaeologists have continued to search for evidence that might illuminate the historical Arthur, or at least the world in which he supposedly lived, conducting excavations at sites with Arthurian associations and surveying the landscape of post-Roman Britain for clues about how people lived during those mysterious centuries. The work is painstaking and often frustrating, as the material culture of post-Roman Britain is sparse compared to the Roman period, with people leaving fewer and less durable artifacts, building in wood rather than stone, and living in ways that leave little trace for modern excavators to find. Yet slowly, site by site and artifact by artifact, a picture emerges of post-Roman Britain that helps us understand whether the historical context could have produced someone like Arthur. The excavations at South Cadbury in the 1960s and 70s, which revealed substantial late 5th or early 6th century refortification and high-status occupation, were followed by investigations at other British hill forts, many of which showed similar patterns of reuse during the post-Roman period, suggesting that the hill forts represented defensive positions occupied by British communities and war bands during the conflict with the Saxons. These fortified sites could have served as bases for military operations, places where mounted warriors could be maintained and from which they could ride out to patrol frontiers, raid enemy territory, or concentrate for major campaigns, exactly the kind of infrastructure that a historical Arthur would have needed to conduct the military operations attributed to him. The discovery of imported Mediterranean pottery at numerous British sites dating to the 5th and 6th centuries has been particularly significant, as it demonstrates that post-Roman Britain was not completely isolated from the wider world and that some British communities maintained wealth and trade connections centuries after the Roman withdrawal. The pottery, which includes amphorae that originally contained wine and oil from the Eastern Mediterranean, shows that British elites had both the resources to pay for expensive imports and the connections to merchant networks that linked Britain to the Byzantine Empire and North Africa. This evidence of continuing sophistication and long-distance contact challenges older views of the post-Roman period as a time of complete collapse and suggests instead a complex transitional period where some communities and leaders maintained relatively high status even as the overall level of material culture declined from Roman standards. A leader like Arthur, if he existed, might have been one of these elites who displayed their status partly through access to foreign luxuries, using imported wine to reward their warriors and entertaining visitors with goods from across the known world, maintaining at least some aspects of Roman aristocratic culture in a post-Roman Britain. The pottery evidence cannot prove Arthur existed, but it shows that the economic and social context would have permitted powerful leaders to emerge and maintain war bands, making the historical existence of such leaders not just possible, but probable. Some archaeological investigations have focused specifically on sites mentioned in Arthurian literature, attempting to determine whether these locations have any genuine historical connection to the legend, or whether they were claimed by later tradition without historical basis. Tintagel, perhaps the most famous Arthurian site, has been extensively excavated, revealing that it was indeed an important high-status site in the exact period when Arthur supposedly lived, with evidence of substantial buildings, extensive Mediterranean imports, and what appears to have been a princely or royal residence controlling trade along the North Cornish coast. The discovery of the slate fragment with a Latin inscription including a name similar to Arthur, while not conclusive, adds to the impression that Tintagel had some connection to the people and events that may have inspired Arthurian legend, even if the specific story of Arthur's conception at the castle is Geoffrey of Monmouth's invention. Glastonbury, despite the fake grave discovered by medieval monks, also has genuine archaeological significance as an important religious site in the post-Roman period, with evidence of very early Christian activity that predates the Saxon conquest of the region, suggesting that Glastonbury was indeed a sacred place in British Christian culture during the centuries when Arthur supposedly lived, even if Arthur himself never went there. The archaeological work at these and other sites has helped to establish that many places associated with Arthurian legend were genuinely important in the post-Roman period, even if we cannot prove that Arthur specifically was connected to them, suggesting that the legends may preserve dim memories of the geography and political importance of certain locations during the Dark Ages. The search for Arthur's grave, which has captivated popular imagination for centuries, has produced no credible results despite numerous claims and investigations. Beyond the discredited Glastonbury discovery, various other locations have been proposed as Arthur's final resting place, from Welsh churchyards to cave systems where Arthur and his knights supposedly sleep awaiting Britain's hour of need. But none of these claims have any archaeological support, and most are obvious products of local folklore rather than historical tradition. The reality is that if Arthur existed and died in battle, as tradition claims, his body might have been buried in any number of locations, marked with a memorial that did not survive, or possibly not marked at all if circumstances were chaotic, and the chances of identifying his specific grave centuries later are vanishingly small even if we knew where to look. The absence of Arthur's grave is not evidence against his existence, as we lack identified graves for most people from this period regardless of their historical importance. But it does mean that this potential source of evidence remains unavailable to scholars seeking to prove or disprove Arthur's reality. Future archaeological work might yet uncover evidence that changes our understanding of Arthur, perhaps an inscription that mentions him, or a burial with artifacts that connect to the legend, or documents that somehow survived in conditions that preserved them. But after more than a century of searching, most scholars are pessimistic about finding such dramatic evidence, believing instead that if we are to understand Arthur, it will be through slow accumulation of contextual evidence about his period rather than through some spectacular discovery that proves his existence beyond doubt. Chapter 12. The Contemporary Sources Revisited. Modern scholarship has subjected the few early written sources that mention Arthur to increasingly sophisticated analysis, using linguistic evidence, historical context, manuscript studies, and comparative textual analysis to determine what these sources actually tell us and how reliable they might be. The text of Gildas's De Excidio, long recognized as the earliest surviving source for post-Roman British history, has been carefully studied to understand what Gildas knew, what he chose to include, and crucially, what he chose to omit, with scholars debating why he never mentions Arthur if Arthur was truly the great British hero of the Battle of Badon Hill. Some scholars have suggested that Gildas might be criticizing Arthur indirectly, that one of the kings he condemns by name might actually be Arthur under a different name or title, or that Gildas deliberately suppressed Arthur's name for political or personal reasons. But these suggestions remain speculative and have not convinced the majority of historians. The most straightforward explanation for Arthur's absence from Gildas remains that Arthur either did not exist or was not important enough in Gildas's view to merit mention, even though this explanation raises its own questions about how Arthur could have been forgotten by Gildas only to be remembered by later Welsh tradition. The study of Gildas has also revealed that his work is not primarily a history but a moral condemnation of contemporary British leaders, meaning that his omissions might reflect his rhetorical purposes rather than historical reality, as he focuses on criticizing living kings rather than praising dead heroes, which might explain why even a historical Arthur does not appear in his text. Nennius's Historia Britanniae has been analyzed to determine how much of its content derives from earlier written sources, how much from oral tradition, and how much from Nennius's own invention, with scholars concluding that Nennius was working with a variety of materials of varying reliability which he combined without much critical judgment. The list of Arthur's 12 battles is particularly problematic, as the place names are difficult to identify and the number 12 is suspiciously symbolic, appearing throughout medieval literature as a conventional number for great deeds, suggesting that the list might be artificial rather than historical. Some scholars have attempted to identify the battle sites by comparing the names Nennius gives with known geographical locations, rivers, and fortifications, producing maps of Arthur's supposed campaigns. But these identifications are often uncertain and sometimes contradictory, with different scholars placing the same battle in completely different locations. The linguistic analysis of the battle names suggests that some are Welsh, some are Latin, and some might be corrupted or miscopied, indicating that Nennius was working with material that had already been transmitted through multiple languages and scribal hands before he wrote it down, increasing the chances of errors and confusion. The Battle of Badon Hill appears in Nennius's list as Arthur's greatest victory, consistent with its importance in earlier sources, but the other 11 battles are otherwise unknown, appearing nowhere else in historical or literary sources, which raises questions about whether they were real events, whether they were important enough to be remembered outside this single text, and whether they were all actually fought by the same person or were collected from different traditions. The Annals Cambry entries mentioning Arthur have been subjected to particularly intense scrutiny, as they potentially provide dates for Arthur's career, placing the Battle of Badon around 516 and the Battle of Camelot around 537, giving Arthur an active career of about 20 years. However, scholars have questioned whether these entries are contemporary records or whether they were added to the chronicle later based on legend, and the manuscript tradition of the Annals is complex enough that interpolation remains possible. The dating system used in the Annals is also problematic, as the chronicle's chronology does not always align with other historical sources, suggesting that the dates given might be approximate or incorrect, and some scholars have proposed adjusting the dates by several decades to better fit other historical evidence. The mention of Arthur carrying the cross at Badon has been discussed extensively, with interpretations ranging from literal miracle to poetic description to scribal error, but all agreeing that the entry presents Arthur as a Christian warrior fighting in the name of his faith against pagan enemies, a characterization that fits the religious dynamic of Romano-British versus Saxon conflict. The Camelot entry, mentioning Arthur and Medraut falling, uses ambiguous Latin that could mean they died fighting each other or fighting side by side, though later tradition uniformly interprets it as Arthur dying while fighting against Medraut's betrayal, showing how later legendary development influenced interpretation of ambiguous historical sources. The early Welsh poetry that mentions Arthur, including Y Gododdin, Pa Gur, and others, has been analyzed for dating and authenticity, with scholars debating whether these poems are as early as they appear or whether the Arthur references were added to older texts. The problem is that Welsh poetry was transmitted orally before being written down, and later copyists might have updated the texts, adding names and details that were not in the original versions, making it difficult to determine which elements are genuinely archaic and which are later additions. Some scholars argue that the poetic references to Arthur are so casual and assume so much knowledge on the audience's part that they must reflect genuine early tradition, as a later interpolator would have been more explicit in introducing Arthur to the text. But others counter that this argument is subjective and that casual references could equally well be later additions by scribes who assumed their audiences would recognize Arthur from popular legend. The linguistic evidence from the poems is also complex, as Old Welsh went through various stages of development, and dating texts based on language features requires expertise in historical linguistics and assumptions about how and when various linguistic changes occurred, assumptions that specialists sometimes disagree about. Despite these difficulties, the Welsh poetic tradition remains important for understanding Arthur because it shows that he was firmly embedded in Welsh culture at an early date, presented in contexts that seem to reflect genuine tradition rather than literary invention, even if we cannot be completely certain about the precise date or original form of the poems. Chapter 13: The Celtic Mythology Connection. One explanation for Arthur that has attracted considerable scholarly attention is the possibility that he originated not as a historical figure but as a Celtic deity or mythological hero who was later historicized, transformed from a god or legendary figure into a supposed historical king through a process that has parallels in other cultures. Celtic mythology is filled with divine and semi-divine heroes who perform miraculous deeds, journey to other worlds, possess magical weapons, and display powers that go far beyond normal human capabilities, characteristics that appear throughout Arthurian legend and suggest possible mythological origins. The name Arthur itself has been analyzed for possible connections to Celtic deities, with some scholars suggesting links to Ardos, a Celtic bear god, or to Artaeus, a Mercury-like deity attested in Roman-era Gaul, though these etymological connections are disputed and other explanations for the name are equally possible. The bear association is particularly intriguing because bears appear frequently in Celtic mythology as symbols of sovereignty and martial power, and if Arthur's name does mean bear man, it might indicate either that he took a symbolic name referencing the bear or that he was originally a bear deity who was transformed into a human king by later tradition. The evidence for Arthur's mythological origins includes his association with the otherworld in early Welsh tales, where he raids and to steal a magical cauldron, fights giants and supernatural beings, and interacts with characters who seem more mythological than historical, suggesting that he was originally conceived as a hero who moved between the human world and the realm of the gods. The theory of Arthur's mythological origins must contend with the fact that by the time we first encounter him in written sources, he is already being presented in some contexts as a historical figure, a leader who fought battles against the Saxons in the post-Roman period, with no overt indication that he is a god being described. Scholars who support the mythological origin theory argue that this historicization was a natural process, as Celtic culture converted to Christianity and as old pagan gods were transformed into human heroes who could be celebrated without violating Christian monotheism, a process seen throughout formerly pagan Europe where divine figures from the old religion became saints, heroes, or legendary kings in the new Christian culture. The transformation of a possible bear god into a British war leader would have been particularly easy because the Romano-British needed heroes. They needed to believe that their struggles against the Saxons had meaning and could be won, and a mythological figure who already embodied martial prowess and sovereignty could be repurposed into a historical champion without too much adjustment to his basic character. The later medieval development of Arthur into an explicitly Christian king, defender of the faith and seeker of the Holy Grail, represents the completion of this Christianization process, transforming whatever pagan roots the figure might have had into an exemplar of Christian virtue. Alternative theories about Arthur's origins propose that he might be a composite figure, built up from multiple historical people and legendary characters who were combined over time into a single persona. This composite theory would explain the geographic spread of Arthur's supposed activities, as victories won by different commanders in different regions could all have been attributed to Arthur as his fame grew, making him into a one-man embodiment of British resistance rather than a single historical individual. The composite theory would also explain the contradictions in Arthur's character, who appears in some sources as a good Christian king and in others as a violent, even tyrannical figure, a discrepancy that might reflect the different historical people whose deeds were combined under Arthur's name. Some scholars have suggested specific candidates for the historical figures who might have contributed to the Arthur composite, including Ambrosius Aurelianus, the Romano-British leader mentioned by Gildas, Riothamus, a British king who campaigned in Gaul in the 5th century, and who appears in contemporary continental sources, and various other late Roman or early medieval British leaders whose exploits might have been absorbed into Arthurian tradition. The problem with the composite theory is that it is difficult to prove or disprove, as it requires accepting that multiple people's stories were combined, but without being able to identify exactly which stories belong to which person or how and when the combination occurred, leaving the theory suggestive but ultimately speculative. The relationship between Arthur and other figures of Celtic mythology, particularly the hero Finn Mac Cumhaill from Irish tradition, has also been explored, with some scholars noting striking parallels in their stories, their characteristics, and their places in their respective cultures. Both Arthur and Finn are leaders of warrior bands. Both possess magical weapons. Both are associated with wisdom and prophecy, as well as military prowess. And both become central figures in extensive cycles of legend that grow over centuries. These parallels might indicate a common Celtic mythological template, stories, and character types that appear across Celtic cultures adapted to local circumstances, suggesting that Arthur's legendary form owes as much to inherited Celtic storytelling patterns as to any historical individual. The comparative mythology approach reminds us that Arthur does not exist in isolation but is part of a broader Celtic and European tradition of heroic legend. And understanding this context is essential for evaluating what Arthur's legend might tell us about history versus what it tells us about the universal human need for heroes and the common patterns that hero stories follow across different cultures. Whether Arthur originated as god, human, or some combination, and whether his legend preserves historical memory or purely mythological tradition, remains contested. But the debate itself has enriched our understanding of how legends form, how history and mythology interact, and how cultures create and maintain their foundational stories. Chapter 14: The Political Uses of Arthur. Throughout history, Arthur's legend has been used for political purposes by rulers, movements, and nations seeking to claim his legacy for their own benefit, transforming the legendary king into a political symbol whose meaning changed depending on who invoked his name and why. The political appropriation of Arthur began early, as Welsh poets presented him as a symbol of British resistance against Saxon conquest, a hero who defended the native culture against foreign invasion and who represented a glorious past when Britain was British rather than English. This Welsh Arthur was explicitly political, representing not just a historical or legendary figure but a statement about identity, about who rightfully belonged in Britain and who were foreign invaders, a distinction that remained politically charged for centuries as the Welsh maintained their separate identity against English attempts at cultural assimilation and political domination. The English eventually co-opted Arthur for their own purposes, claiming him as an English hero despite the obvious fact that if he existed, he fought against the English ancestors, a contradiction that English writers resolved by treating Arthur as a king of all Britain, a unifying figure whose legend transcended the ethnic divisions between Welsh and English, and who could be claimed by both as part of a shared heritage. The Norman and Plantagenet kings of England were particularly enthusiastic users of Arthurian propaganda, as they sought to legitimize their rule by connecting themselves to an ancient British kingship that predated both the Norman conquest and the Saxon kingdoms. Edward I, who conquered Wales in the late 13th century, made extensive political use of Arthur, claiming to have found Arthur's crown, presenting himself as Arthur's successor, and using Arthurian imagery to justify English dominion over the Welsh, Scots, and Irish, arguing that just as Arthur had supposedly ruled all of Britain, so should the English king. Edward even held Arthurian round table tournaments, elaborate pageants where nobles dressed as Arthurian knights and reenacted scenes from the romances, performances that were simultaneously entertainment and political theater, demonstrating Edward's cultural sophistication and reinforcing the connection between his crown and the legendary British king. The Scottish, resisting English conquest, developed their own counter-narrative, sometimes diminishing Arthur's importance or questioning his achievements, using historical arguments to challenge English claims that Arthur's supposed overlordship of Scotland gave English kings the right to rule the Scots, showing how the historical debate over Arthur was never purely academic but always entangled with contemporary political conflicts. The Tudor dynasty, ruling England and Wales from 1485 to 1603, made particularly elaborate use of Arthurian symbolism because they were of Welsh descent and could claim a special connection to Arthur through their ancestry. Henry VII, the first Tudor king, named his eldest son Arthur, intending him to embody the return of the legendary king and to symbolize the unification of the Welsh and English crowns under a dynasty that could trace its roots to Britain's ancient past. When Prince Arthur died young, before he could succeed to the throne, the dynastic plan was disrupted, but the Tudors continued to use Arthurian imagery throughout their reign, with Elizabeth I being compared to various Arthurian heroines and the Tudors presenting themselves as fulfilling ancient prophecies about Arthur's return. The political use of Arthur by the Tudors shows how a legend could be adapted to serve monarchical propaganda, providing historical legitimacy for a dynasty that had won the crown by conquest and needed to convince their subjects that their rule was not just successful but predestined and historically justified. The fact that Arthur probably never existed did not diminish his political usefulness, for legends can be more powerful than facts when they are widely believed and deeply embedded in cultural consciousness. And Arthur's legend had become so central to British identity that any ruler who could claim him strengthened their own position regardless of the historical truth. Modern nations and movements have continued to find political uses for Arthur, with Welsh nationalism claiming him as a symbol of Welsh resistance and identity, with Cornish regionalism using him to assert Cornwall's distinct Celtic heritage, and with various groups across the political spectrum invoking Arthur to support their particular visions of what Britain should be. The legend's flexibility allows it to serve multiple, sometimes contradictory political purposes simultaneously, with conservatives seeing Arthur as a symbol of traditional values and hierarchical order, while progressives see him as representing an idealistic attempt to create a more just society through the Round Table's supposed equality, and with everyone finding in the legend whatever they seek. The political uses of Arthur reveal an important truth about legends and historical figures more generally, which is that their meaning is never fixed but constantly negotiated by each generation according to their own needs, concerns, and ideologies, making the question of what Arthur really was or whether he existed almost secondary to the question of what people have believed about him and how those beliefs have shaped historical events. Arthur's political career has been far more extensive and consequential than his supposed military career, affecting medieval politics, Tudor dynasty building, national identity formation, and modern debates about heritage and history, demonstrating that legends have real power in the world regardless of their relationship to historical fact. Chapter 15: The Literary Evolution continues. The Arthurian literary tradition did not end with Malory or the medieval romances, but has continued to evolve through the modern period, with each generation producing new versions of the legend that reflect contemporary concerns and literary styles while maintaining connection to the traditional stories. The Victorian revival of interest in Arthur, led by Tennyson but including many other poets, novelists, and artists, transformed the medieval Arthur into a Victorian gentleman, emphasizing duty, morality, and restrained emotion in ways that reflected Victorian values and Victorian anxieties about social change, industrial development, and the loss of traditional certainties. The Victorian Arthur was thoroughly domesticated, less the warrior king of Geoffrey of Monmouth and more a constitutional monarch who ruled through moral authority and force of character, a transformation that made the legend more accessible to Victorian middle-class readers but also obscured the darker, more violent aspects of the medieval tradition. The pre-Raphaelite artistic treatment of Arthurian themes created an aesthetic vocabulary for visualizing Arthur's world that combined medieval manuscript illumination with 19th century romanticism, producing images of incredible detail and symbolic density that shaped how subsequent generations would imagine Camelot, Guinevere, Lancelot, and the other characters of the legend. The 20th century brought more psychologically complex and sometimes darker interpretations of Arthurian legend, with writers exploring the human motivations behind the traditional plot points and questioning the idealizations of earlier versions. T.H. White's The Once and Future King subjected Arthur to psychological analysis, portraying him as a thoughtful man trying to overcome his own limitations and the limitations of his society, creating a vision of Arthur that was more human and flawed than Tennyson's moral exemplar, but also more interesting and relatable. White's work influenced later writers and filmmakers, establishing a modern approach to Arthurian material that valued character development, political sophistication, and willingness to subvert traditional expectations, treating the legend as a starting point for creative exploration rather than as a sacred text to be faithfully reproduced. The musical and film Camelot, based loosely on White's work, brought Arthur to an even wider audience in the 1960s and became associated with John F. Kennedy's presidency, showing how Arthur could still serve as a contemporary political symbol even in the modern democratic era, representing idealism, youth, tragedy, and the dream of a more perfect political order. Feminist retellings of Arthurian legend began appearing in the later 20th century, giving voice to female characters who had been marginalized in traditional male-authored versions, particularly Guinevere and Morgan Le Fay, who were often portrayed as either passive victims or dangerous temptresses in earlier works. Writers like Marion Zimmer Bradley, in The Mists of Avalon, retold the legend from Morgan's perspective, transforming her from a villain into a protagonist defending the old pagan religion against the encroachment of Christianity, a reinterpretation that reflected contemporary interest in feminism, paganism, and alternative spirituality. These feminist retellings not only gave agency to female characters, but also questioned the values of traditional Arthurian legend, challenging the glorification of warfare, the patriarchal assumptions underlying courtly love, and the Christian framework that later medieval writers had imposed on what were originally Celtic stories. The feminist Arthurian tradition has become a substantial body of literature in its own right, demonstrating how the legend's flexibility allows it to be completely reimagined from different perspectives while maintaining recognizable connections to the traditional material. The late 20th and early 21st centuries have seen Arthurian retellings that explore the legend from every possible angle, including from the perspective of minor characters, from historically grounded novels that attempt to portray the 6th century realistically, from fantasy novels that embrace the magical elements and expand them, from young adult fiction that adapts the stories for teenage readers, and from literary fiction that uses the legend as a framework for exploring contemporary themes. The influence of Arthurian legend extends beyond works that explicitly retell or reference Arthur's story, as the archetypes, situations, and themes of Arthurian literature have become so embedded in Western culture that they appear everywhere, from advertising to political rhetoric to popular entertainment. The tragic love triangle between Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot has become a template for stories about love, loyalty, and betrayal, recognizable even to audiences who have never read Malory or Tennyson. The Round Table as a symbol of equality and fellowship appears in political and business contexts when people want to suggest collaborative decision-making without hierarchy, though the medieval Round Table was actually quite hierarchical with positions of greater and lesser honor. The quest narrative, central to Arthurian romance, has become a fundamental structure in Western storytelling, appearing in everything from fantasy novels to science fiction to mainstream fiction, often without any explicit connection to Arthur, but following patterns that the Arthurian tradition helped establish. The Grail quest in particular has become a metaphor for any spiritual or idealistic search, with people speaking of quests for truth, justice, meaning, or self-realization, using language that derives ultimately from medieval Arthurian romance, even when the speakers are unaware of the connection. Arthur's cultural impact extends far beyond the question of his historical existence, as the legend has become part of the foundational mythology of Western culture, a set of stories, images, and ideas that shape how people think about leadership, heroism, loyalty, tragedy, and the eternal struggle between ideal and reality. Chapter 16: The Continental Connections. The question of Arthur's possible historical existence becomes more complex when we consider continental European connections, as some sources place British leaders in Gaul during the 5th and 6th centuries, raising the possibility that a historical Arthur might have campaigned on the continent as Geoffrey of Monmouth claimed, though probably not conquering most of Europe as Geoffrey's narrative suggests. The historical figure most often connected to Arthur through continental evidence is Riothamus, described in contemporary continental sources as a king of the Britons who led an army into Gaul around 470 to fight as an ally of the declining Roman Empire against various Germanic tribes. Riothamus is mentioned by name in letters and chronicles written by people who were his contemporaries, making him one of the few British leaders of this period whose existence is historically certain, and some scholars have proposed that Riothamus might actually be Arthur, or that his exploits contributed to the Arthur legend even if they were not the same person. The name Riothamus is actually a title meaning supreme king or most kingly, rather than a personal name, so the historical Riothamus might have had another name by which he was known to his own people, possibly even a name like Arthur, though this is pure speculation. The connection between Riothamus and Arthur is strengthened by the geographic location where Riothamus last appears in the historical record, which is in the region of Avalon in Burgundy, a name that suggests a possible connection to Avalon, the mystical island where Arthur was supposedly taken after his final battle. The theory identifying Arthur with Riothamus has attracted some scholarly support but also faces significant difficulties, primarily the problem that Riothamus was active in the 470s, several decades before the Battle of Badon Hill, which is traditionally dated around 500, meaning that if Arthur is Riothamus, the chronology of Arthur's career as described in Welsh sources must be completely wrong. Supporters of the identification argue that the Welsh dates might indeed be wrong, as early medieval chronology is often uncertain, but skeptics point out that moving Arthur several decades earlier creates as many problems as it solves, particularly in explaining how someone active in the 470s could be associated with a battle that other sources clearly place around 500. The Continental Campaign attributed to Arthur by Geoffrey of Monmouth might preserve a distant memory of Riothamus's actual continental expedition, transformed and expanded by legend into a grand imperial conquest, or it might be entirely Geoffrey's invention, inspired by other British legends or by Geoffrey's desire to make Arthur into a figure of European significance rather than merely an insular British hero. The fact that some Britons did cross to the continent and fight there during the 5th century is historically certain, as numerous sources document British military activity in Gaul and the significant British migration to what would become Brittany, where British refugees established kingdoms and preserved their language and culture, creating a lasting British presence on the European mainland. The British migration to Brittany deserves particular attention because it represents a historical movement of population from Britain to the continent during the very period when Arthur supposedly lived, driven by the Saxon invasions that were making large parts of Britain uninhabitable for the British population. The Britons who settled in Armorica, the region that became Brittany, brought their legends and traditions with them, including stories of Arthur, and Breton tradition developed its own distinctive Arthurian material that influenced the later French romances. The connection between British and Breton Arthur traditions is well documented in the medieval period, with Breton storytellers contributing significantly to the development of Arthurian romance, and the legendary forest of Broceliande in Brittany becoming an important location in Arthurian geography. Whether this Breton Arthurian tradition derives from legends the British migrants brought with them from the island, or whether it developed later and was influenced by the spread of Arthurian material from Wales and England, remains debated, but the international scope of Arthurian tradition from an early date is clear. The spread of Arthur's legend to continental Europe demonstrates both its appeal and its adaptability, as each region that adopted the stories modified them to suit local tastes and concerns, creating a pan-European literary phenomenon that transcended its supposed British origins. The possibility that Arthur might have some connection to continental history through Riothamus or other British leaders active in Gaul adds another layer of complexity to the historical investigation, suggesting that if we search for Arthur only in British sources and British archaeology, we might be looking in the wrong place or at least looking too narrowly. However, the continental evidence is almost as fragmentary and difficult to interpret as the British evidence. And while Riothamus is a historical figure, connecting him definitively to Arthur requires accepting a chain of speculative reasoning that many historians find unconvincing. The continental connections remind us that post-Roman Britain was not isolated, that British leaders and populations moved between the island and the continent, and that the political and military situation in Britain was connected to the broader collapse of Roman power across Western Europe, all of which provides important context for understanding the world in which a historical Arthur might have lived. Whether Arthur himself had any personal connection to continental Europe beyond Geoffrey of Monmouth's imagination remains unknown, but the international dimension of his legend and the historical reality of British activity on the continent during his supposed period both deserve consideration in any comprehensive examination of the Arthur question. Chapter 17: The Linguistic Evidence. Language offers another avenue for investigating Arthur, as the name itself, the names of associated characters, the place names mentioned in early sources, and the linguistic forms of the earliest texts can all provide clues about when and where Arthurian traditions developed. The name Arthur is itself problematic, as its etymology remains uncertain despite extensive scholarly analysis, with proposed origins including the Roman family name Artorius, the Celtic word for bear, or possibly combinations of Celtic elements meaning noble or high. The distribution of the name Arthur in the historical record is suggestive, as it appears to become popular as a given name in Wales and other Celtic regions during the late 6th and 7th centuries, which some scholars interpret as evidence that there was a famous earlier Arthur after whom parents named their children, much as the name Winston became popular in mid-20th century Britain because of Winston Churchill. However, the interpretation of naming patterns is subjective, and the appearance of the name Arthur in the late 6th century could alternatively indicate that the legendary Arthur was being developed during this period rather than that he had lived earlier, with the name being created for or associated with the legendary figure and then adopted by real people inspired by the legend. The linguistic forms of place names associated with Arthur in early sources have been analyzed to determine whether they represent genuine early tradition or later invention, with mixed results. Some place names appear to contain genuine Old Welsh or Brittonic elements that suggest early tradition, while others seem to be later constructions or to contain elements that are difficult to explain, raising questions about whether the entire battle list in Nennius, for example, is historically based or partially fabricated. The difficulty in identifying many of the places Nennius mentions might indicate either that the names have been corrupted through manuscript transmission and translation, or that they were never very specific to begin with, possibly being generic descriptions like river battle rather than actual place names, or that they are fictional locations created for literary effect. The linguistic analysis of early Welsh poetry mentioning Arthur has attempted to date these texts based on the form of the language they use, with the results suggesting that some Arthur references might be quite early, possibly dating to the 7th or 8th centuries in oral form even if they were not written down until later. But the methodology of linguistic dating is complex and assumptions must be made about the rate of language change and about whether written texts accurately represent the spoken language of their time. The personal names of characters associated with Arthur in early tradition have also been examined for clues about the legend's origins and development, with scholars noting that many of these names appear to be genuinely Old British names rather than later inventions, suggesting that the core of Arthurian tradition might preserve authentic onomastic material from the post-Roman period, even if the stories themselves have been thoroughly transformed. Names like Bedwyr, Kai, Gwalchmai, Gawain, and Gwenhwyfar, Guinevere, all have plausible Celtic etymologies and appear in forms that suggest they were not created by medieval romance writers but were inherited from earlier tradition. Though whether these names belong to historical people or were traditional names used for legendary characters cannot be determined from linguistic evidence alone. The later romances introduce many characters with obviously French or Norman names, showing how the tradition expanded and changed as it moved beyond its Celtic origins, with characters like Lancelot, whose name is French, being late additions to the legend rather than part of the earliest tradition. The linguistic evidence thus supports the idea that there is a genuine early Celtic core to Arthurian tradition, but it cannot tell us whether that core is historical or mythological, whether it preserves memories of real people and events, or whether it is traditional material that was never historically based. The language of the earliest Arthurian texts themselves provides information about when and where they were composed, with Old Welsh texts clearly stemming from Wales, Latin texts like Nennius and Geoffrey of Monmouth showing influence from both Welsh traditions and classical Latin literary conventions, and French Romance showing how the legend was translated both linguistically and culturally as it moved from Celtic to Romance language contexts. The process of translation and adaptation inevitably changed the stories, as concepts that made sense in one language and culture had to be explained or transformed to work in another, and as different literary traditions had different conventions for how stories should be told, how characters should behave, and what themes were appropriate. The linguistic journey of Arthurian legend from Welsh to Latin to French to English and eventually to virtually every European language represents a process of continuous reinvention, with each linguistic version adding new layers of meaning and interpretation that moved the legend further from whatever historical origins it might have had. Modern scholars studying Arthurian texts must often work in multiple languages, comparing Welsh, Latin, French, and Middle English versions of similar stories to understand how the tradition developed and to try to identify the oldest recoverable forms of the material, a challenging task that requires extensive linguistic expertise and careful attention to the dating and relationships between manuscripts. Chapter 18. The Arthurian sites today. The physical locations associated with Arthur have become tourist destinations, archaeological sites, and places of cultural significance where the legend remains alive in the landscape and in the communities that preserve connections to the Arthurian tradition. Tintagel in Cornwall, perhaps the most famous Arthurian site, attracts hundreds of thousands of visitors annually who come to see the dramatic clifftop ruins and to experience the location where Arthur was supposedly conceived. Even though the visible castle ruins date from the 13th century and the historical connection to Arthur is tenuous at best, English Heritage, which manages the site, must balance the competing demands of historical accuracy, tourist expectations, and conservation, presenting Tintagel both as a genuine Dark Age site with important archaeological remains and as a place of legend and imagination where visitors come seeking connection to a story rather than just historical information. The recent construction of a dramatic new bridge at Tintagel, which spans the gorge between the mainland and the island section of the site, has generated controversy, with critics arguing that such modern interventions detract from the historical atmosphere, while supporters contend that the bridge enhances visitor access and experience, illustrating the ongoing tensions around how Arthurian sites should be presented and interpreted. Glastonbury, despite the fake medieval grave, remains strongly associated with Arthur and has become a center for alternative spirituality, neo-paganism, and New Age beliefs that see the location as sacred and powerful, a place where the veil between worlds is thin and where ancient mysteries can be accessed. The Glastonbury tour, the the prominent hill rising above the town, has become a pilgrimage site for people seeking spiritual experience, many of whom connect the location to Arthur, to the Holy Grail, and to pre-Christian Celtic religion, creating a living tradition of Arthurian belief that is quite different from academic historical investigation but is nonetheless real and meaningful to its participants. The town of Glastonbury has embraced its Arthurian and mystical associations as part of its identity and economy, with shops, tours, and festivals centered on legend, spirituality, and alternative culture, making Glastonbury a unique place where Arthur's legend continues to actively shape a community and a landscape centuries after the medieval monks manufactured their famous discovery. The relationship between historical truth and living tradition is particularly complex at Glastonbury, as the site has become meaningful precisely because of its legendary associations, meaning that for many people the historical facts matter less than the spiritual and cultural significance the place has acquired. South Cadbury, the hill fort in Somerset with genuine late 5th or early 6th century refortification, is less developed for tourism but remains significant for those interested in the historical investigation of Arthur. The site is managed by heritage organizations and is accessible to visitors who climb the hill to see the substantial ancient earthworks and to imagine what the fortress might have looked like when it was an active military stronghold during the post-Roman period. The archaeological excavations at Cadbury in the 1960s put the site on the map as a potential Camelot, and while most archaeologists would now resist such simple identification, the site remains important as evidence for what was happening in post-Roman Britain during the period when Arthur supposedly lived. The landscape around Cadbury preserves other sites from various periods of British history, creating a palimpsest where different eras and different stories are layered over one another, much like the Arthurian legend itself combines elements from different times and different sources into a single complex narrative. The contrast between heavily tourist sites like Tintagel and quieter sites like Cadbury reflects different approaches to Arthurian heritage, with some locations embracing their legendary associations and others taking a more cautious approach that emphasizes archaeological evidence over romance. The Arthurian sites scattered across Wales, Cornwall, Scotland, and even Brittany in France create a geography of legend that allows enthusiasts to undertake Arthurian pilgrimages, visiting multiple sites associated with the stories and experiencing the landscapes that shaped the tradition or were shaped by it. These sites range from major attractions to remote hill forts, from ruined castles to caves, from lakes where swords were supposedly thrown to battlefields where history and legend intermingle. For some visitors, these sites are opportunities to learn about genuine history and archaeology, to understand the post-Roman period and the development of medieval legend, while for others they are places of imagination and inspiration, locations where the boundaries between history and story become pleasantly blurred and where the legend feels alive and present. The tourism and cultural heritage industries built around Arthurian sites demonstrate the legend's enduring economic as well as cultural value, as communities benefit from visitor spending while also preserving their connection to stories that have been told for over a millennium. The physical presence of Arthurian sites ensures that the legend remains grounded in real places and real landscapes rather than existing only in books and films, giving it a tangibility and immediacy that purely literary figures cannot achieve, and allowing each generation to experience the legend through direct encounter with the places it describes or claims. Chapter 19: Modern Media and Arthur. The 20th and 21st centuries have seen Arthur appear in virtually every form of media, from novels and academic studies to films, television series, comic books, video games, and internet content, each medium interpreting the legend according to its own conventions and constraints and reaching audiences that earlier generations could never have imagined. Film in particular has brought Arthurian legend to massive global audiences, with productions ranging from serious historical dramas attempting to portray the real Arthur to fantastical adventure films embracing magic and romance to comedies that parody the legend. The variety of approaches reflects both Arthur's flexibility as a character and the different reasons audiences are drawn to his story, with some seeking historical education, others wanting escapist entertainment, and still others looking for deeper meanings about leadership, ethics, and human nature. Major films like Excalibur by John Boorman presented a mystical, symbolic Arthur drawing heavily on medieval romance tradition, while films like King Arthur, starring Clive Owen, attempted a grittier, more historical approach, placing Arthur in the late Roman period as a cavalry commander leading Sarmatian horsemen, though this historical approach still took significant liberties with the sparse evidence. The Disney animated film, The Sword in the Stone, introduced Arthur to generations of children, presenting the story as a coming-of-age tale about a boy discovering his destiny and shaping how many people first encounter the legend. Television has produced multiple Arthurian series, with shows like Merlin reimagining the legend for contemporary audiences, in this case presenting Arthur and Merlin as young men growing up together, inverting the traditional age dynamic and exploring themes of friendship, destiny, and moral choice in ways that resonate with modern viewers while maintaining recognizable connections to the traditional story. The BBC series attracted a large international audience and demonstrated that Arthurian material remains commercially viable in the competitive modern television market, particularly when adapted to include elements that appeal to contemporary tastes such as humor, romantic subplots, diverse casting, and production values that match viewer expectations shaped by big-budget fantasy productions. Other television adaptations have taken different approaches, with some emphasizing the dark, violent aspects of the Dark Ages and others focusing on the romantic and courtly elements, showing how the same source material can generate very different productions depending on the creator's interests and intended audiences. The serialized nature of television allows for more extended character development and plot complexity than films typically permit, making television a particularly suitable medium for exploring Arthurian legend, which in its medieval form was itself often serialized, with characters and storylines developing across multiple interconnected romances. Video games have created interactive Arthurian experiences where players can inhabit the world of Camelot, make choices as Arthur or other characters, and influence how the story unfolds, adding a dimension to Arthurian legend that no previous medium could offer. Games range from strategy titles where players manage kingdoms and armies to role-playing games where they undertake quests, to puzzle and adventure games where Arthurian elements provide setting and atmosphere. The interactive nature of games changes the relationship between audience and story, as players are not passive recipients of a fixed narrative but active participants whose choices affect outcomes, raising interesting questions about how Arthurian legend adapts to this agency. Some games attempt historical accuracy within their gameplay mechanics and setting, while others embrace fantasy elements, and still others deliberately subvert expectations, offering alternative versions of Arthur's story where traditional outcomes can be avoided or changed. The global reach of video games means that Arthurian legend is now encountered by audiences in Asia, Africa, and Latin America who might have little connection to British or European culture, but who engage with the stories through gaming, further internationalizing a legend that began as the property of Celtic-speaking peoples on the western edge of Europe. The internet has created new forms of Arthurian content and new communities of Arthurian enthusiasts who share information, debate theories, create fan fiction and fan art, and keep the legend alive through their engagement and creativity. Online forums dedicated to Arthurian topics allow scholars and enthusiasts to discuss the latest archaeological findings, to debate historical theories, and to share their interpretations of the texts, creating a democratized space for Arthurian studies that exists alongside but separate from traditional academic institutions. Fan communities produce enormous quantities of creative content based on Arthurian legend, from stories that explore relationships between characters to artwork that visualizes scenes and settings to videos that edit together clips from various Arthurian films and shows, creating new narratives from existing material. This participatory culture around Arthur represents a continuation of the process that has always shaped Arthurian legend. As each generation and each individual adds their own interpretation, their own emphasis, and their own creativity to the shared body of story, ensuring that the legend continues to evolve rather than becoming fixed and fossilized. The accessibility of Arthurian content online means that anyone with internet access can explore the legend in unprecedented depth, reading medieval texts in translation, viewing academic lectures, visiting virtual tours of archaeological sites, and connecting with others who share their interest, making Arthur perhaps more accessible now than at any point in the legend's long history. Chapter 20: The Question of Historical Truth. After exploring the early sources, the archaeological evidence, the literary development, and the cultural impact of Arthurian legend, we must return to the question that began this investigation. Is there any truth to the King Arthur legends? The answer, as should now be clear, is complex and depends on what we mean by truth and what level of evidence we require before accepting something as historical. If we demand contemporary written evidence from Arthur's lifetime or archaeological proof that can be definitively linked to him personally, then we must conclude that Arthur's historical existence remains unproven and quite possibly unprovable, as the nature of evidence from the post-Roman period is such that proving the existence of any individual who did not appear in continental sources or leave inscribed monuments is extraordinarily difficult. The historical record from 5th and 6th century Britain is so fragmentary that many events and people who certainly existed have left no trace, making the absence of solid evidence for Arthur less damning than it might be for a figure from a better documented period. If instead we ask whether the historical circumstances could have produced someone like Arthur, whether the pattern of early references suggests a historical basis, and whether the legend might preserve authentic memories even if the details are unreliable, then a case can be made that there probably was someone, a British military leader of the late 5th or early 6th century, whose victories against the Saxons were significant enough to be remembered and celebrated, and whose memory became the seed from which the legend grew. The moderate position, which seems to be where many historians have arrived after decades of debate, acknowledges both the possibility of a historical Arthur and the impossibility of proving it definitively with currently available evidence, accepting that we must live with uncertainty and recognize the limits of historical knowledge about this period. This position does not require us to choose between Arthur existing or not existing, but allows for the more nuanced conclusion that he might have existed, that certain elements of the legend might be based on history while others are certainly fiction, and that separating these elements is a task that may never be completed to everyone's satisfaction. The value of studying Arthur, from this perspective, lies not in solving the mystery once and for all, but in understanding the world that produced the legend, in exploring how historical memory works and how legends develop, and in appreciating Arthur as a cultural phenomenon that has influenced Western civilization for over a millennium regardless of whether he was originally a real person. The scholarly investigation of Arthur has produced valuable insights into post-Roman Britain, into the nature of early medieval historical sources, into the development of medieval literature, and into how societies create and use legendary heroes, making the Arthur question historically significant even if the specific question of his existence remains unresolved. For those who want a definitive answer, this uncertainty is frustrating, but it reflects an honest engagement with evidence that is genuinely ambiguous rather than a failure of historical method. The most responsible conclusion is that Arthur might have been a historical figure, probably a military commander rather than a king in the later medieval sense, who fought against Saxon invaders in the late 5th or early 6th century and achieved significant victories that gave hope to the embattled Romano-British population, and whose memory was preserved in Welsh tradition and gradually elaborated into legend over subsequent centuries. This hypothetical historical Arthur would have been very different from the Arthur of medieval romance or modern films, lacking Camelot's castle, the Round Table, the Grail quest, and most of the knights whose stories we know, living in a much harsher and simpler world than later imagination created, fighting not for courtly ideals but for cultural survival, and dying without knowing that he would become one of the most famous figures in all of literature. Whether this hypothetical figure actually existed, we do not know and may never know. But the legend he supposedly inspired has taken on a life and significance entirely independent of its possible historical origins, becoming a story that transcends time, culture, and circumstance to speak to universal human experiences and aspirations. The truth of Arthur's legend may lie not in historical facts, but in emotional and psychological truths, in the story's ability to articulate hopes for justice, fears of betrayal, the tragedy of flawed idealism, and the longing for a golden age, whether that age existed or not. The legend tells us that people need heroes, that societies in crisis create stories about leaders who fight against overwhelming odds, that we want to believe in places like Camelot where virtue and valor are rewarded, and that we recognize in Arthur's fall a pattern that repeats throughout history when human weakness undermines noble intentions. These truths have value whether or not a man named Arthur once lived in post-Roman Britain, and they help explain why the legend has survived so long and adapted so successfully to changing times and cultures. The historical investigation of Arthur has its own value in training us to think critically about sources, to recognize the difference between evidence and speculation, and to understand how much of what we think we know about the past is actually uncertain. But we should not let the historical questions overshadow the cultural reality of Arthur as one of humanity's great legendary heroes, whose story will continue to be told regardless of what historians conclude about his existence. Chapter 21: The Legacy That Endures. The true measure of Arthur is not whether he existed, but what his legend has meant to countless generations who have found in his story something that spoke to their own lives, their own struggles, and their own dreams. From the early Welsh bards who sang of Arthur's battles to the Norman chroniclers who made him a king, from the French romancers who created Lancelot and the Grail quest to Malory who wove it all together, from Tennyson who gave Victoria's England a moral exemplar to modern writers who continue to reimagine the tale, Arthur has been continuously reinvented while remaining somehow essentially himself, the once and future king whose story never ends because each age needs to tell it again in its own way. The legacy of Arthur extends far beyond literature to influence politics, culture, art, music, film, and even place names across Britain and beyond, making him one of the most influential legendary figures in Western civilization, comparable to figures from classical mythology or biblical tradition in his cultural impact. The fact that we still debate Arthur's existence 1,500 years after he supposedly lived demonstrates his enduring power and relevance. For wholly fictional characters rarely generate such passionate historical investigation, while genuinely historical figures from the same period have been long forgotten except by specialists. Arthur's story has offered different lessons to different eras, serving as whatever people needed him to be. A symbol of resistance for the conquered Welsh, a legitimizing ancestor for medieval kings, a model of chivalry for the nobility, a Christian allegory for religious writers, a tragic hero for romantics, a political idealist for progressives, a defender of traditional values for conservatives, and a blank canvas for creative reimagining by countless artists and writers. This flexibility is both Arthur's greatest strength and the source of much confusion, as the multiple Arthurs, historical, legendary, literary, political, spiritual, exist simultaneously and are often conflated or confused, making it difficult to discuss Arthur without specifying which Arthur we mean. The multiplicity of Arthurs is not a problem to be solved, but a feature of how legends work, as they must be able to adapt and change to remain relevant, to speak to new audiences and new circumstances while maintaining enough continuity that the story remains recognizably itself. Arthur has managed this balance better than almost any other legendary figure, remaining both ancient and contemporary, both British and universal, both specific in his medieval details and timeless in his themes. The places associated with Arthur, whether their connections are historical or purely legendary, have become part of Britain's cultural heritage and national identity. Sites that attract visitors from around the world and that contribute to local economies and community pride. The stories of Arthur have inspired countless works of art, from medieval manuscripts illuminated with scenes of Camelot to pre-Raphaelite paintings to modern graphic novels, creating a visual tradition that allows people who have never read Malory or Cretin to recognize Arthur, Guinevere, Lancelot, and Merlin instantly. The music inspired by Arthurian legend ranges from medieval songs to Wagner's operas to Broadway musicals to film soundtracks, creating a sonic dimension to the legend that enhances its emotional impact. The literary tradition of Arthurian romance, stretching from the 12th century to the present day, represents one of the longest continuous literary traditions in Western culture, with no sign of ending as new books, films, and series appear regularly, each claiming to offer the definitive version or the true story or a necessary reimagining, and each finding audiences hungry for more Arthur, despite the thousands of versions that already exist. The educational value of Arthurian legend extends beyond English literature classrooms to history, archaeology, anthropology, linguistics, and cultural studies, as Arthur serves as a nexus point where multiple disciplines intersect and where students can explore how legends develop, how history is constructed, how literature evolves, and how culture is transmitted across generations. The debates over Arthur's existence introduce students to historical methodology, to the evaluation of sources, to the problems of fragmentary evidence, and to the reality that much of history is uncertain and open to interpretation rather than being a fixed set of facts to be memorized. The study of Arthurian literature allows students to trace how stories change over time, how different cultures adapt material to their own needs, and how literature reflects the values and concerns of the society that produces it. Using a body of material that spans more than a millennium and multiple languages, cultures, and literary forms. The interdisciplinary nature of Arthurian studies makes it ideal for teaching students to synthesize information from multiple sources, to think critically about evidence and interpretation, and to appreciate the complexity of cultural phenomena that cannot be reduced to simple explanations or single causes. Conclusion. As we reach the end of this long exploration through the mists of time and legend, we find ourselves returned to where we began, standing at the border between history and myth, looking back at a figure who may or may not have lived, but who undeniably lives still in human imagination and culture. The question of whether King Arthur was real has no simple answer because the evidence is insufficient for certainty, and because Arthur means different things in different contexts, historical or legendary, British or universal, medieval or modern. What we can say with confidence is that post-Roman Britain was a time of crisis and conflict, that the Romano-British did resist Saxon invasion for generations, that this resistance must have had leaders whose names and deeds would have been celebrated, and that the memory of these struggles was preserved in Welsh tradition where it became associated with a figure called Arthur who may represent a historical individual, or multiple individuals, or an entirely legendary creation, or some combination of all three. The transformation of whatever historical basis might exist into the magnificent edifice of Arthurian romance represents one of the most remarkable developments in all of literature, showing how human creativity can take simple materials and build from them something complex, beautiful, and enduring. The legend of Arthur has survived because it speaks to something fundamental in human experience, the desire for heroes who embody our best qualities, the tragedy of noble endeavors defeated by human weakness, the hope that goodness and justice might triumph even when circumstances seem hopeless, and the dream of a perfect society where virtue is rewarded and evil is punished. Camelot represents not a place that ever existed, but a place that always exists in human imagination, an ideal against which reality is measured and found wanting, and a goal toward which we might strive even knowing we will never fully achieve it. Arthur himself, whether he began as a historical warrior or a mythological hero or a pure invention of medieval fantasy, has become something larger than any of these origins, a symbol of leadership, of tragedy, of hope, and of the eternal human struggle to create meaning and order in a chaotic world. The story tells us that even the greatest achievements are temporary, that betrayal can come from those we trust most, that love and duty sometimes conflict impossibly, and that despite all this, the attempt to build something better than what came before remains worthwhile even when it is doomed to fail. The investigation into Arthur's historical existence will continue as long as there are historians willing to examine the evidence and debate its meaning. But the legend itself no longer depends on historical proof for its power or relevance. Arthur belongs now not to history but to culture, to imagination, to the collective human need for stories that help us understand ourselves and our world. Whether he rode across 6th century Britain fighting Saxons or whether he never existed outside of storytellers' imaginations makes little practical difference to the legend's ability to inspire, to entertain, to provoke thought, and to connect us to centuries of people who have told and retold his story. The once and future king remains future as much as past, always about to return, always relevant to the next generation, always ready to be reimagined for new audiences and new times. In this sense, Arthur is immortal not because he lives forever, but because his story does, pass from generation to generation, changing and adapting while remaining essentially itself, a gift from the distant past to all the futures yet to come. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps you can imagine yourself standing on a mist-covered hillside in ancient Britain, watching mounted warriors ride past on their way to battle, their equipment worn and repaired but still serviceable, their faces tired but determined, following a leader whose name might be Arthur or might be something else entirely, fighting for a cause that will be lost but not yet, not today, still believing that victory is possible and that their struggles matter. Or perhaps you stand in a medieval hall, listening to a bard sing of King Arthur and his knights, of Camelot's glory and its fall, watching the audience lean forward to catch every word of a story they have heard before but want to hear again, finding in the old tale something that speaks to their own lives. Or perhaps you find yourself in a modern bookstore or cinema, encountering Arthur once more in whatever form he has taken for this generation, recognizing the story's bones beneath new flesh, and feeling the connection to all those who came before who also found meaning in this legend. The truth of Arthur lies not in proving he existed, but in understanding why we need him to have existed, why his story matters, and why after 1,500 years we still tell it, still argue about it, still find in it something essential about what it means to be human, to hope, to fight, to fail, and to be remembered.